So I started noticing that the chunky sneaker aesthetic started to creep its way back into public consciousness around 2014. At the time, I was really into Air Maxes. I loved the Air Max 90s. I ended up buying a pair. I loved the Tailwind 7s. I also ended up buying a pair. And I thought that the 95s were pretty hideous. Though since then I have warmed to a select few, but the sentiment still stands. Then around that time, we also saw the rise in popularity of other shoes like Huaraches, which I for a long time pronounced Tuaregs, no shame, and the dreaded sneaker heel. But I never really thought that the chunky sneaker aesthetic would go to where it has actually gone. Now, when I had first become aware of this chunky sneaker trend, I honestly didn't take it that seriously or really think much of it. But then Balenciaga released their Triple S7s, and that is when I, like many of you, reacted with a sort of... Here Balenciaga, one of the biggest names in high fashion, was telling us that this shoe is a trend that is legitimate and that is here to stay. And whether you hate it or love it or just don't understand it, chunky sneakers are here. They are a definite focal point within today's fashion, okay? They are large and in charge. And when it comes down to it, I definitely believe that they will be cemented within the fashion history books. But how exactly did we get here? How did we get to a point that said that this is fashion? Now, fashion at a lot of different times for a lot of different people can mean a lot of different things. For some, it can mean art. For others, it can mean life or popularity or classism or racism or self-expression or beauty, or it's all just meaningless. Like, you see no real point to any of it. But there's one thing that cannot be debated, and that is that fashion is complicated. Okay, fashion is fickle. Fashion doesn't know what fashion wants. She's constantly swinging on a pendulum, going back and forth and reshuffling ideas. Fashion exists in a cycle in that way. So it's bound to happen that the chunky sneaker would become a trend again. But when it comes to the how and why chunky sneakers are a trend again is where I became interested. So I thought that I would go ahead and explore chunky sneakers and how it is that we got here. Now, one of the first things that needs to be understood is that chunky sneakers were born out of a time where the people coming of age have not only realized but also internalized the fact of just how transparent things like the American dream and all that come with it are. The young generations of today are no longer afforded the same kind of socioeconomic mobility and stability as was promised to generations past. That normalcy, structure, and rigidness that the children and young adults of the 50s and 60s seem to take for granted are the very things that we, the children and young adults of today, ironically subconsciously long for. Our world no longer has this illusion of stability. We know that the powers that be aren't for us and in some cases are against us.
Weapons of mass destruction.
And we know that the very institution that is supposed to be of, by, and for us is none of those things.
God bless America.
And that really does something to the psyche of generations now and beyond who, when coming into this world, are coming in having to find ourselves, instead of the world telling us who we are. A world that then perpetuates the idea of the individual and how everyone is special in their own way and that everyone deserves a participation award kind of mentality. The very thing that we, the generation that didn't create it, always seems to get blamed for. And not to say that I'm complaining that the people my age and younger are allotted this kind of freedom, but when you really think about it, if you're constantly having to search for yourself in an already unstable world where there doesn't seem to be any real kind of truth, then where exactly does that leave you? Well, it did leave us in a world where we felt isolated, detached, and disillusioned even. And not to say that we've conquered those feelings, because if anything, we're just now really starting to scratch the surface. But we have now moved past that, wow, this is fucked up, there's no point to anything, so don't even try cynical kind of mindset, and have instead adopted it. For us, it's not a matter of, wow, this is fucked up, as much as it's, okay, so now what? And we seem to feel that now what end with the search for meaning and connection with others, which at its ironic core seems to be all about the adaptability of the individual and their ability to blend into a crowd.
Look at me! I'm blending in! I'm invisible!
It's all about the welcoming of a kind of sentimental sameness where instead of running away from it, you embrace it because, well, you realize that perhaps being alone isn't always necessarily the best way to deal with what's going on around you. And it's that kind of ambivalent state that gave way to what became known as normcore. Normcore, which is a word that is a combination of normal and hardcore, was first coined back in late 2013 with the trend forecasting group K-Hole describing it not simply as a fashion trend, but more generally as an approach to the world. It's about adaptability and being able to go into a lot of different communities at once. It's about finding liberation in not being special, but in being the same. And when it comes to how that then gets expressed through something like, say, fashion, it's all about an anti-fashion trend that embraces the most mundane, unremarkable, and unextraordinary of clothing. Fashion for a long time was seen as a means of expression, as a way of standing out from the crowd. Well, normcore turns that on its head and in a rather genuine way. In a post-truth world where nothing seems to make sense anymore, it's that acceptance of this reality of absurdity that feeds us and allows for us to keep going. Dressing ordinarily and intentionally valuing function over everything else is our subconscious way of embracing the instability of an ever-changing world. Normcore is the answer to the what now, and the Seinfeld-like fashion is just one manifestation of that.
I hate clothes, okay? I hate buying them. I hate picking them out of my closet. I can't stand every day trying to come up with little outfits for myself.
Now, when it comes to fashion and its relationship to the public, generally speaking, it's been fairly one-sided. Though it says a lot about the times, fashion usually comes from the higher-ups and trickles down. So basically, the fashion industry tells us what the new in thing is, and we, the public, then act accordingly. Now, of course, I'm not saying that we're all walking around sporting this chic ensemble, but the fashion industry definitely plays a much bigger part on the average consumer's fashion sense and taste than what we would like to say or even realize.
And it's sort of comical how you think that you've made a choice that exempts you from the fashion industry when in fact you're wearing a sweater that was selected for you by the people in this room from a pile of stuff.
What was different about normcore was that with the advent of social media that democratized fashion in a way to where everyone now has a say in what is fashionable, it really subverted that relationship to the point where the fashion industry was now the one taking the notes. The trend this time came from the bottom and trickled its way upward. It was the public that was telling the fashion industry what they deemed to be the new appropriate in thing. Things like joggers, minimalist shoes, jeans meant for your parents, oversized glasses, athleisure wear, bomber jackets, Birkenstocks, windbreakers, Crocs, fanny packs, turtlenecks, thrift store findings, bucket hats, baseball caps, fleece. The very things that are supposed to be the antithesis of fashion became fashionable. And all of those things are elements that you can find within subcategories of normcore, like gorbcore, which is all about taking on the outdoor wear aesthetics with a focus on things like puffer jackets, Velcro, and waterproof everything. Or momcore, which, as I'm sure you can guess, is all about the mom aesthetic of yoga pants, mom jeans, and prairie dresses. But the cores to end all cores, the one that has seemed to garner the most amount of attention throughout these normcore years, and the one that I want to focus on, is dadcore. If normcore is like the parent, and gorbcore, momcore, and dadcore are its offspring, the first two are like those kids that just kind of make it through life, whereas the latter is the one that goes on to really make a name for themselves and do wonderful things. Dadcore is all about practicality and comfort because, well, you're supposed to dress as the quintessential dad would. Dads are too caught up in dad-like things to ever care about what is supposedly in fashion and what isn't. So it would make sense that dadcore would flourish under the normcore aesthetic. Things like orthopedic sneakers, ill-fitting and wide-legged jeans, baseball caps, loafers, tucked-in shirts with belts, random or non-logo t-shirts, plaid button-ups, things that were for so long ridiculed, mocked, and critiqued for not being fashion-forward are now ironically as fashion-forward as forward fashion can get. It's all about being lazy, but with pride. And with people so unsure of the future, sometimes it makes sense to want to hold on to those things that are safe and that are comforting and that remind us of a time where it wasn't always this way. Or, of course, it could be our millennial way of subconsciously seeing the only viable way of attaining the secure dad suburban lifestyle, complete with a 401k plan and a nice retirement savings, is simply through clothing. And perhaps to older generations that may seem frivolous, superficial, or empty even. But just remember, you made it this way. So with this now being the new big thing amongst the public and the fashion industry basically having to play catch up, came the rise of what became known as ugly fashion, which is essentially, as I see it, the industry's way of reclaiming the narrative.
Reclaiming my time, reclaiming my time, reclaiming my time.
It's like the ironic version of normcore. It's basically the fashion industry looking at something like normcore and saying, oh, okay, so y'all want to trend something that's anti-us. Well, guess what? We can do that too, sis. Okay, if y'all want boring, if y'all want mundane, if y'all want basic, we'll give you oversized, we'll give you shapeless, we'll give you swallowing. Okay, we can do it all. It's like the industry is tapping on the shoulder of every normie, whispering in their ear, "You're doing it wrong." And then giving a light chuckle and then skipping away like how New York did after her fight with Delicious.
Did I or did I not? Just
Never to be seen again until they come out with some wild fashion thing. It's basically how I would expect for the fashion industry to react to something like normcore. Now, when it comes to ugly fashion, it definitely gives way to the debates of, well, what is ugly and how do we define it and who gets to define it, etc., etc. But for the sake of this discussion, let's just go with the idea that ugly doesn't automatically mean repulsive, because ugly constantly changes depending on who you ask and in what context. In this context, ugly is more about something that goes against the norm or the conventional, and you can understand ugly fashion as something that isn't necessarily flattering. It's pretty mismatchy, human form engulfing, and usually makes use of layers.
Could I be wearing any more clothes?
It wholeheartedly rejects the demand to look good by taking the conventionally ugly and making it beautiful, usually by exaggerating it, with beautiful, of course, being the operative word. Ugly fashion takes that genuineness out of normcore and instead exploits its aesthetics for the fashion industry's gain. It's basically their checkmate.
Aha!
And so that finally brings me to chunky sneakers. Though we can trace the origins of the chunky sneaker trend back to 2013 with the release of Raf Simons' Oswego Adidas sneaker, it wasn't until 2014 with the re-release of Adidas' Stan Smith sneaker that the trend started to gain some footing. The trend, however, didn't really take off until late 2017 with the controversial release of Balenciaga's SSS 7s, though I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we did know of the Yeezy Rave Runner 700s, another controversial shoe in its own right before the SSS 7s. However, to see such a high-end fashion label like Balenciaga debuting a clunky and awkward orthopedic shoe with an already worn and distressed look to them was a definite shock to public consciousness at the time.
I think they're ugly, I think they're impractical. There's nothing redeeming about these.
What are those? It was a merge of high and low fashion for the ages. A natural blowback to the sleek, minimalist tech runner shoes that dominated the time just before them, chunky sneakers have come about in a time where fashion proportions seem to be reaching new levels of oversized normcore. Shirts are longer, pants are fuller, and jackets are puffier. So you can ironically look at the chunky sneaker as a sort of grounding mechanism for today's fashion. If the clothes themselves are simple sans their proportions, then it kind of gives the go-ahead for something like, say, the shoes to be a bit wilder. Plus, it wouldn't really look right if you're pairing oversized everything with sleek, minimalist sneakers. It's all about balance. And I'm sure that you hear the word balance and look at something like, say, this and say, balance? And you're right, it is exaggerated to the max. But in all fairness, the chunky sneaker and ugly fashion trends are rooted in a kind of exaggeration of old and plain styles. This is why I look at these trends as the fashion industry's troll. These trends don't rely on the same old, tired silhouettes as much as it's about taking that idea and scaling it outward to create a sense of size that is rather obtuse. It's about taking that thing that has been deemed ugly for years and recontextualizing and revamping it for more avant-garde and sartorial taste. The dad shoes that we have come to know over the years are pretty dull and boring, and of course you do have certain shoes that will definitely capitalize off of their newfound fame. But this new trend takes that silhouette and overlays panels, mixes materials, blows out shapes, throws in wild colorways, and adds huge soles, all in the name of of contemporary and modern day fashion. Ugly fashion is just one of the ways in which society is attempting to subconsciously take on the world around them. Everything isn't awesome. The past is bleeding into the present is unstable, and the future has never been more unsure. We have seemed to adopt these ordinary, ill-fitting, and engulfing clothing perhaps as a way of trying to find comfort in an already uncomfortable world. Or maybe it's our way of forcing people to get to know the person behind the clothes instead of letting the clothes speak for the person. Either way, one shining aspect of this trend, the chunky sneaker, in its own weird and artistic way, is not only our way of dealing with this ugly reality, but taking it a step further, our way of sifting through the ugliness to perhaps find something and or create something beautiful. Yes, the world may be a fucked up mess and life may be a shit show, but if we all realize that we're not alone and that we are more alike than we are different, then maybe, just maybe, it may help to make things a little better.
Well, life is a fucked up mess. Life is a fucked up mess.